Hey there guys, alright, today we are watching a video that I saw pop up on my recommended feed, so I was intrigued. This is the election of George Washington was weirder than you think by pre-modernist. Now I've never seen this, I've never watched a video from this channel before, so I do not know what to expect. So it should be fun. Y'all know my thoughts on George Washington. I don't like him. I think really there were only he had two decent traits that I can actively point to. That being, I cannot deny that he was likely a very charismatic person at the time while he lived, because you do not hold together um, the U.S. the army that we had, that the Americans had at the time during their revolution. You do not hold that thing together in the state that it was unless you are a charismatic person. Like, I'm talking extremely, like, he has to be extremely charismatic. I don't see really anything else, like, possible, to be able to hold that mess together. And two, he relinquished power. That's about all I can say good about it. So, let's go ahead and dive right in.
The first U.S. presidential election in 1789 was very different from the way Americans do presidential elections today.
God, honestly, our elections used to not be like this. Like, just 20 years ago, they weren't this bad. They're fucking awful now, man. Ugh.
1789, there were no official candidates. There was no campaigning for the office. There were no political parties, no nominating conventions, no primary elections. The entire election season was very short. And the major issue of this election was the Constitution itself, whether the very system that they were using as the basis for the election, whether they would keep the system. Okay, well, you might be thinking, why were they electing a president for the first time in 1789? Didn't they declare independence in 1776? What were they doing for those 13 years? Well, they didn't have a president during those 13 years. It's important to remember that the United States...
But they did. There was a position under the... I mean, it held no power. But there was the title of president. Now, it is, again, nowhere near the same position as the executive branch that would be established with George Washington's election. But if he looks like he's a professor, so he probably knows more than me. But I know there was a president. I know the term was used for a position in those 13 years. But obviously, I'm not an American history historian, so maybe in American historical field, maybe they are making that distinguishment between the two titles. That yes, there was a title of president, but it was not at all the same, and so then they say there wasn't a president for those 13. Do I make sense?
States of America was not originally a single country. It was a collection of 13 separate countries. The 13 colonies that were participating in the rebellion had each been separate from each other.
13 colonies that more or less, right? None of them were really like, there wasn't really much, you know, I think we all know that, like, when while the revolution was ongoing, it was kind of a pretty, I believe, my interpretation of it from the things I've seen, that the enthusiasm for the revolution was a pretty, like, kind of even split. It was largely a, mercantile elite that wanted it.
Distinct colonies with ties between themselves and Britain, but not really ties amongst themselves between the different colonies. So when the 13 colonies declared their independence, they did so not as a single unified country, but as 13 separate countries in association with each other, what we would today call an international organization, in order to accomplish their common goal of freeing themselves from British rule. There was only one branch of government effectively on the federal level, which was
Okay, key term there, effectively.
the Continental Congress. Although to call it the federal level is a stretch, because there wasn't a federal government, so to speak. Anything that the Continental Congress decided to do had to be enforced by the states, and if a state did not want to enforce it, they didn't have to. Some people at the time saw this as a problem, and they thought that the states would be better off if they entered into a closer union with each other. This was mainly for financial reasons, but I'm not going to get into that. So
Valid.
they held a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787, in which they drafted the Constitution that we use today in the United States. Now, this new Constitution was different from the way it had been before. So under the old system, you had one branch of government, the Continental Congress. In this new system, there were three branches of government. There was the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. The legislative branch would consist of Congress, but now Congress would have two separate houses, a House of Representatives, which would represent the people directly, and the Senate, which would represent the states. And then the executive branch would be headed by a president. And then,
However, how times have changed, right? This aspect here, no longer a thing. No longer a thing. When did that disappear? I'm trying to remember. Was it only in the I think it was in the 1900s we did away with this and it's become a direct vote? I don't know. Honestly, a part of me, like, here's the thing, right? If we're going to continue to have our Congress separated between House and Senate, I do kind of personally believe that this is the way that it should probably go back to, which y'all know how far to the left I am. And I don't know if this is like a more middle ground or even right conservative kind of aspect. But like, right, there needs to be like, what is the difference between the House of Representatives and the Senate on a fundamental level if both are directly voted by the people? The time in which that they get voted on, really, right? Senators, they don't got to worry about re-election. They only have to worry every 6 years. The House got to worry every 2 years. But it also, I feel, I mean, there is a disconnect here. I mean, we're gonna get to election stuff. The House of Representatives is not very representative of the people anyway. If we look at what bills they have been passing, they have not been, especially with the TikTok ban, they're not very representative of the people's wishes that they are supposed to be representing. Now the Senate is not supposed to represent the will of the people. However, that has changed, right? Just fundamentally, like, voters directly voting for the people in Senate fundamentally changes that the senators are now supposed to be representatives of the people's will. Right? They are no longer representatives of the state. They are representatives of the people that voted for them and that they want to vote for them again. And so, if we want to justify the Senate's continued existence and not just merge these two together and just then overhaul the representation of Congress, you got to go back to the state legislatures choosing who makes up the Senate. Because I think the system as it is, where we have two halves of Congress, both voted on by the people, and neither of them are really representing the people, then we got a failed system. Congress is not doing what it's supposed to be doing. It's not working as it's supposed to operate. That's another conversation, not at all related to this video. That was just a tangent that I needed to air out.
And under him would be everyone who is in charge of executing the laws passed by Congress. And then the judicial branch was headed by the Supreme Court, and then there would be various courts.
Fucking, we need to get rid of them. Just get rid of them. They're, maybe back in this time, they were an effective thing. Nowadays, nope. Nope. I don't think they've been effective since before I've been alive.
Underneath the Supreme Court. So, one of the questions that the framers of the Constitution had to answer was how are they going to get the president chosen? Now, one obvious choice would be to have him chosen by Congress. That would essentially make it a parliamentary system. Like in most English speaking countries, there's a parliamentary system where Parliament decides who the prime minister is going to be, and the prime minister runs the government. The framers of the Constitution.
I wouldn't be. That's a decent system. I mean, I go back and forth on. Now, obviously, I believe that the popular vote should decide ultimately the president, right? Whether or not that popular vote is then via Congress, right? Popular vote chooses our representatives, and then our representatives, they then pick a president amongst themselves or fucking whatever. That there's an appeal to that system, right? There's right, we elect the politicians that are able to make themselves appealing to us. But then amongst each other, they decide who amongst them would be either the most popular or like the most effective executive or whatever, right? We're talking ideals. Obviously, when we look at Britain and France and Canada and Germany, all the countries that have the parliamentary system, it is far from perfect. But fundamentally speaking, how it's supposed to work, right? Decent. But also then we look at how we have it. If we were to remove the Electoral College, which we should, it should just be done by popular vote. The president could then be someone that is not of the majority in Congress, which could be a nice balancing act that the parliamentary system would not have. Which does end up leading to a potentially less effective form of governance, depending on how you want to look at it, right? Because then because then you have to be bipartisan and stuff like that. Anyways.
Did not want to do that. And by framers, I mean the men who met in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 and drafted the Constitution. They're called framers, the framers. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to maintain a strict separation between the executive branch and the legislative branch. So that was off the table.
But the executive nominates the judicial branch. I think that's, well, obviously then the Congress is supposed to approve the judicial branch. And so a lot of the issues that honestly probably, I think on a very fundamental level with this system, if we ignore essentially human nature to devolve into political parties, it's this is a thing, right? This is a thing that has plagued us long before Rome. Every form of government has had this issue of political parties, right? Right, we have the triumvirate under Caesar. That's a political, Caesarians, a political party. It's an unavoidable fact of just, I feel, human governance. Now, of course, America has I would argue, a fairly unique issue in that it is very split, just 50-50. Most other places have a very more spread out amongst 6 or 7 political groups. America's just got 2. Obviously we have more than 2, but there's pretty much only 2 that win the seats. Sometimes maybe another party could win, as an independent. Bernie Sanders win a senator seat or a House seat, but they do not run. They have zero chance of winning unless they run as a Democrat or Republican for the presidential position. What was I saying? Oh, yes. On a fundamental level, the system, as described, not too bad, right? Not too bad. I doubt I could make up a better system. I'm not, right? That's not where my education lies. That's not where I'm smart at. But also, right, at the very least, it is not the moment by partisanship political parties messes with that system, it gets fucked. It gets fucked, as we see today.
How else could they elect the president? Well, one option, which is the option I think most Americans today would take for granted, was that the president would be elected directly by the voters. The framers of the Constitution.
Well, he wasn't. I mean, at the time, obviously today, he wasn't really elected by the voters. He was elected by an elite who then could just, like, the Electoral College could just, for the longest time, I think even some states, they can still do this. They can just ignore how the people of the state voted and just cast a vote for someone else, which of course I think was supposed to be another balancing check of, like, the electoral voters would be educated people that could then determine whether or not the person that the people have voted for is a dangerous person and should not be president. But that thing is not, that thing's ignored.
Also didn't like that idea. They thought that would be not
Okay,
practical.
no, I paused too soon. Oops.
To do that, and also not wise. So the framers hit upon another system that was neither of those two things. What they would have would be the famous Electoral College, this body of individuals who exist within the executive branch, so you don't have to worry about cross-contamination with the legislative branch. And the Electoral College's only job was every 4 years they would elect the president.
Oh, was there not even originally any input by the voters? I always thought it was like, I always thought for the longest, like, from the beginning, we just had, obviously, landowning white men casted votes, and you got the information of who they wanted, but then the Electoral College could ignore that if they wanted. That's how I always viewed it.
Now, how do you choose the members of the Electoral College? Well, they just left that up to the states.
Okay, so it's, wait, huh?
However the states wanted to do that. If the state legislature wanted to choose their electors, they could do that. If the state legislature wanted to leave that up to the voters to decide, they could do that too. So the American presidential election has two stages. First, you have to choose the electors. And then once the electors are chosen, they choose the president. That's still the system that's used in the U.S. today. And when Americans go to the polls in early November of an election year, they're voting for electors. And then the electors meet, nowadays it's in the middle of December, and they cast their votes for president, and that's the actual election of the president. So what we call Election Day is actually the election of the electors. The Constitution gives Congress the power to decide when each of those elections happens, when the electors are elected and when the president is elected. Nowadays, it's early November and mid-December. In this first election in 1789, the election of electors happened on January 7th, and then the electors would meet and choose the president on February 4th, 1789. So Election Day in 1789 was January 7th. That was what we would call Election Day. Now, some online sources will say that this particular presidential election happened over 2 years, 1788-89. It's not quite true. The election was January 7th, 1789. It was just in 1789. Where that's kind of true is in two states, in New Hampshire and Massachusetts. They actually had a two-stage process for choosing their electors. They would have
I'm really liking this video.
Voters
This is really good.
essentially
This is
nominate who they would want to have as electors, and then the state legislature would choose from a list that the voters sent up to the legislature. So in both New Hampshire and Massachusetts, the voters went to the polls. Polls isn't the right word. The voters went to their town meetings and voted for who they'd like to be elector. And then those names...
Is there any chance that we can get more information? Like, what? This is the one thing that I have a problem. Another major issue I have with the Electoral College system, just because I think it's fucking dated and probably was even dated when it was made. Like, who the fuck are the like, what do you mean by the electors? Like what does that like? Is that a position someone can just run for, or is it just like the governor, state legislature is like, yeah, we're nominating Billy Bob, he's one of the electors, and then right next to him's John, vote between them, choose which one you want to elect. Huh? What? What are we dealing with here?
Went to the state legislature, and on January 7th, the state legislature picked from among those
This is just an overly complicated system that should not be here. Not anymore.
that list. But in the other states that participated in the election, it was just January 7th, 1789.
Oh, there's the question. Okay. Okay.
Now, there were 11 states that participated in the election of 1789. Rhode Island and North Carolina had rejected the Constitution and therefore were technically not part of the United States and not participating in the election.
Huh.
In 5 of the states, the
How'd they
state
get roped in?
legislatures
Anyway.
chose the electors. In 4 of the states, the electors were chosen directly by the voters. And then in 2 other states, they had a hybrid system. Now let's take a minute and look at the states that did direct elections, because they did it differently in the different states. In Pennsylvania and Delaware, they had statewide elections, meaning in Pennsylvania, wherever you were in the state, if you were voting in the election, you voted for 10 names. And then the top 10 vote getters statewide would become elector.
Ranked choice? Why don't we have that anymore? Bring it back. Bring it back. It's, again, not a perfect system, but it's probably the best system that we currently have designed. Ranked choice. Fucking give it to us, Americans. Things would change so fast. Please.
Delaware did the same thing, but they had 3 electors, so wherever you were statewide, you voted for 3 names. In Maryland, it was also statewide.
Okay, well, it's technically that wouldn't be ranked choice. It's just, well, I mean, in a way it is. It's like you're voting, I guess, well, it's kind of ranked choice. Sort of, in a way. I mean, it's sort of ranked choice. It's ranked choice adjacent.
Right, everybody wrote down 8 names because Maryland got 8 electors. But Maryland had a rule where 5 of the names had to come from the Western Shore and 3 of the names from the Eastern Shore. Virginia did it a little bit differently because the Virginia legislature actually created electoral districts. Virginia got 12 electoral votes, and so the legislature divided the state up into 12 electoral districts. Each one would elect 1 elector. And these were distinct from the 10 congressional districts that Virginia had. Virginia was the only state to do it this way. So looking at the different states and the way they did it, that reflects the politics of the different states. So Pennsylvania, for example, the Pennsylvania legislature was dominated by Federalists, meaning people who were pro-Constitution. Support for the Constitution tended to be stronger in the cities. So they thought by making it a statewide ballot, it would make it more likely for Federalists to be elected as elector. The Virginia legislature was dominated by Anti-federalists, people who were opposed to the new Constitution. And they wanted to improve the rural vote. And so
Gerrymandering has been with us since the very beginning. It's as American as, I don't know what. It's American. Hoorah.
so they drew districts to make it more likely that rural people would be elected as electors.
Well, that pisses
And
me
rural
off. God
people
damn
were
it,
more
Virginia.
likely to be opposed to the Constitution. And this touches on the big issue of the presidential election that year, which was the Constitution itself, whether the Constitution was even a good idea. It was extremely controversial in a way that I think most Americans today probably don't really realize. But there were a lot of people who were opposed to the Constitution at the time, and the passage of the Constitution was quite controversial in several states. Some Americans felt like the Constitution was a betrayal of the goals of the Revolutionary War. They felt like they had traded one tyranny for another. They'd gotten rid of the tyranny of the British Parliament and the British monarchy, and they had now were instituting a new tyranny of a new federal system. A lot of Americans, especially in rural areas and out in the western areas, were afraid that this new federal system would be opposed to their own interests, that the federal government would be dominated by commercial interests from the port cities, and would make policy decisions that would financially benefit the big port cities and disadvantage rural areas. In fact, this controversy between those who favor the Constitution and those who are opposed to it ended up making it so that New York could not participate in the presidential election at all
Well,
because the New York legislature was divided. The upper house, the Senate, was majority Federalist. The lower house, the Assembly, was majority Anti-federalist.
hmm.
So the Senate, which was 10-8 in favor of the Constitution, wanted each house of the legislature to choose 4 of New York's 8 electors. The Senate would choose 4, and the Assembly would choose 4. And that way, 4 of New York's 8 electors would be pro-Constitution. The Anti-federalists wanted the legislature to decide on the electors as a whole. So each member of the legislature would get 1 vote. They would have 1 slate of 8. Essentially, they would choose them in a joint session of the 2 houses. What that would mean practically is that all 8 of New York's electors would be anti-Constitution. So the Assembly would pass a bill saying this is how we're going to choose our electors.
Oh God, our fucked up system has it's inherent. It's inherent. Oh. How can we fix the system, the problems that we have with our system, specifically Congress, and the executive branch and the judicial? How can we fix this system when it is working exactly as it was designed for? It is working as it has since the very fucking beginning. Oh, I am depressed now.
Electors. It would go to the Senate. The Senate would say, no, we're not going to do it that way. They would pass their own bill that would go back to the Assembly, and the Assembly would turn it down. It went to conference committee. They argued over it, couldn't come to a resolution. This went on for weeks. Then January 7th came, and they were deadlocked. So midnight, January 7th, they still hadn't chosen their electors. That was it. So they did not have electors. The same gridlock meant that New York had no senators because it was up to the state legislature to choose senators. So it took them until, I think, the summer of 1789 to finally decide who their senators were going to be. A similar thing actually happened in New Hampshire because New Hampshire's legislature was also divided in a similar way. But in that case, the Anti-federalists in the lower house of the New Hampshire legislature gave in and agreed to the Senate's terms. So New Hampshire did, and it was very close to midnight when they made that compromise. So New Hampshire did end up participating in the election. Now, this business of whether an elector was pro-Constitution or anti-Constitution, what was that about? The Constitution ended up getting approved in these 11 states, but there were a lot of people who were uncomfortable with it. And so what they hoped they could do was get a second convention. That's what they wanted to have. They wanted to get a second constitutional convention that would draft a different constitution that would be more acceptable to the Anti-federalists. Barring that, they could, at the very least, get elected to positions within the federal government and then undermine the federal system from within, and thereby prevent the full weight of the federal government from coming into force, perhaps make people disillusioned with the federal system and provoke them to agree to a new constitutional convention. Another thing was, if you get anti-federalists elected to Congress, at the very least, they could be clamoring to get amendments. Now, when the Constitution was approved in the various states, the pro-Constitution people promised, which seems a little bit shady in retrospect, honestly, but they said, oh, go ahead and approve the Constitution now. We promise we'll adopt amendments later. So people were
I mean, it works. It works.
voting for the Constitution with the promise in the future. It wasn't really binding, but with this understanding that in the future amendments will be adopted, which ended up happening. You know, that was the Bill of Rights, which came into effect in 1791. But that was the idea of electing anti-Constitution electors. They were hoping that if you get enough anti-federalists as electors, then they could cause problems for the presidential election. Everybody knew that Washington was going to become president. They knew that actually back in 1787 when they were drafting the Constitution. George Washington was one of the Virginia's delegates, and he was actually sitting there in the room while they're all talking about the president, and it was kind of an open secret that they're creating this office, and George Washington's going to be the guy they're going to put in that office first. So the Federalists were afraid that anti-federalist electors might mess up the election. And how would they do that? The framers of the Constitution created this system where the electors would vote for 2 people for president rather than 1 person. And then the person who got the most votes would become president, and the person who got the second most votes would be vice president. And the weakness of this system became apparent immediately, because the way it's supposed to work is George Washington will get the most votes, and then John Adams will get the second most votes. Then you get president, vice president. Great. But what if George Washington does not get the most votes? What if he gets the second most votes? What if some anti-federalist electors decide not to vote for George Washington? Maybe they vote for Adams and then some other candidate, just some throwaway name. They could potentially throw the election to Adams, making John Adams the first president and George Washington the vice president. Now, the problem with that is Adams was not as popular as Washington, especially in the South. And so that could reduce the goodwill that the general public had for
I see the argument
federal
being
government,
made.
right?
Okay.
And so that would help to undermine the federal government and therefore achieve the ends that the anti-Constitution people had. That was something that the Federalists were afraid could happen. Or
I feel that's a
alternatively,
legitimate fear.
another possibility would be if there were enough anti-federalist electors, they could get George Washington elected president and then an anti-federalist elected vice president. Now, among the anti-federalists, there were a few names, but I think the most common name that was bandied about at the time was George Clinton. If you were an anti-federalist elector, it was expected that you would end up voting for Clinton, maybe Washington Clinton or maybe Adams Clinton. You know, you could do that. So just to give you an example of a possible thing that could play out, the Federalist electors could vote for Washington and Adams, and then the anti-federalist electors could vote for Adams and Clinton. And so then Adams ends up getting the most votes. Washington comes in second, Clinton comes in third. That makes Adams the president, Washington the vice president. Just as one example of many possible permutations of this. So the point is, the system that was written into the Constitution was a bad system.
Already being taken advantage of. Gotta love the Electoral College.
Having the electors vote for two names and not designate which one they wanted to be president, which one they wanted to be vice president was a flaw. And people at the time recognized that as a flaw. So remember, there are two stages of electing the president. First, you get the electors, and then the electors choose the president. So the electors were going to meet and choose the president on February 4th. In the run-up to that Electoral College vote, some political figures in the country were trying to organize a system where they would make sure that Adams didn't get as many votes as Washington. And the most prominent figure in this movement was Alexander Hamilton. He was writing a ton of letters to different people. He was not the only one involved with this. There were a few others also who were writing letters.
Man, I wonder, I'm curious. What if what if fucking Hamilton didn't get himself killed? Like, what if he had lived? What, right? Like, he was by the time of his death, I don't think he was popular anymore. I mean, still, he could have been influential in some degree. I wonder where would we be? I'm not saying maybe we'd be in a better place. There's always a chance that we could have been in a better place. But like, I mean, he was a smart man, smart treasurer.
Different states writing to the different electors saying, make sure you don't vote Washington Adams. Make sure there are some guys, there who are going to vote for somebody besides Adams. So if you
No. Nice, Washington 69.
Look at the results of the 1789 election. You look at the Electoral College votes. It looks like, everybody voted for Washington, and then a bunch of people voted for Adams, and then there were a bunch of small vote totals for other people. A lot of those votes were deliberate throwaway votes where they would have voted for Adams, but deliberately chose not to vote for Adams because they were trying to mitigate against a potential anti-federalist scheme. In Connecticut, they had 7 electors.
Damn, they've got like fucking 5D chess going on here. They're like, what are the anti-federalists? What could they do? All right, so we're gonna do this, and just in case they try and do.
5 of them voted for Washington and Adams. 2 of them voted for Washington and Huntington. The votes for Huntington were going to go to Adams. They voted for Huntington as part of the scheme that Hamilton was organizing. In Pennsylvania, again, those 2 that voted for Hancock would have voted for Adams. In Maryland, there were 8 electoral votes. 2 of the electors could not actually make it to the election. The Electoral College meets on a state-by-state basis, so the electors in each state come together In Maryland, the 8 electors were supposed to meet in Annapolis to do their voting. 2 of the electors couldn't make it. One of them was sick. He had gout and therefore couldn't travel. The other one was unable to because of ice that blocked. I think he had to cross either the Chesapeake Bay or a river, and it was filled with ice, and so he wasn't able to make it to Annapolis. Only 6 electors in Maryland participated. All 6 of them voted Washington and Harrison. Harrison was Chief Justice of the Maryland General Court. He was not a national figure. They voted for him purely as part of Hamilton's scheme to make sure that Washington came in first and Adams came in second. They would have voted for Adams otherwise. Now, not all of these votes were like that. In some of the states, the electors really were voting for someone besides Adams because they didn't want Adams. They wanted somebody else instead. I think the votes for John Jay were like that. I think the votes for John Jay were legitimately for John Jay. I mean, I did a lot of reading about this, but I couldn't figure out exactly for every single state what the motivations were of the electors. But if I were to guess, and this is based on incomplete research of the election, I think the election would have looked more like this if there hadn't been so much strategic voting. Now, this setup of the way the electors would vote for president, voting for 2 names and not distinguishing which one you wanted to be president and which one vice president, this continued to be a problem in every presidential election after this until they fixed it. And they finally fixed it in the 12th.
Patched it. Patchwork, now fix it. It's still a bad system.
Amendment, where they said that electors will say which one they're voting for president and which one they're voting for vice president. The election results really hurt John Adams. I mean, he didn't have any expectation of being elected president. He, like everyone else, expected Washington to get the most electoral votes, but he didn't expect to get as few electoral votes as he got. And he felt kind of devastated by that.
Oh no, his feelings are hurt. Oh, the rich white man. The rich white man is upset. Oh no. Oh no. The rich white man who's gonna settle for second place is upset. He's still...
It's kind of sad because it didn't have to happen that way. They didn't have to worry that the Anti-Federalists would pull off a scheme, because they didn't. All the fears about Anti-Federalist shenanigans came to nothing. Washington easily got all 69 electoral votes, and
Nice.
Adams wasn't going to get more than him. There were enough people voting for Hancock and John Jay and Rutledge to prevent Adams from tying with Washington. So it's kind of sad how that worked out. But anyway, those are the election results. George Washington was elected president. John Adams was elected vice president. They both traveled to New York, which was the first seat of the federal government, and were sworn in the spring of 1789 to begin their first terms, respectively. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this election. If you're an American, do you think it'd be better or worse to have our elections the way they were back in 1789?
God, no.
If you're not an American, how much better do you think your system is compared to the original American system of 1789?
I think... Alright, so this video is actually a lot, a little bit more... I mean, I knew it was going to be ultimately about the electoral process, but I didn't think we would be really just getting a video on the election, how the election worked the very first time, which I appreciate. All right, that's not what I was going and expecting, but it's a pleasant twist of my expectation, I guess. I thought, I don't know, that we were gonna get some weird whack job stuff. I don't know. I'm not quite sure what I was expecting, but this video was good. I have got no complaints with it, aside from my complaints are with the system. The American electoral system is fucked. I stand by what I said in regards to the Senate. Either we got to go back to the state legislatures choosing the senators, or got to combine Senate and House into one. What's the point in separating the two when both are directly voted on by the people to represent the people? Now, does that mean I want to fucking vote every 2 fucking years? No. No, I don't. Maybe we just do every 3 years. But then, then we got to deal with the. I don't see. Like, I'm not. My brain isn't wired in a way to correct the issues of the American election system. But something very clearly has to change. It is not doing good. It's not doing good. But I yapped for longer than I thought I would in this video. Mainly complained about American elections and our representation in our Congress and how shitty it is. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you guys want to see me react to more stuff from this channel, as long as there's no copyright claims. Like, just saying that as a cautionary thing. Sometimes it happens. Like, there are some channels that I really liked in the past that I've watched, but unfortunately they copyright claimed it, which I've got no problem with content being copyright claimed. Like, ultimately, I do not care, but like, it just means I won't react to them and have you, like, I'll still probably watch the content on my own time, but like, you guys won't see me watching that content and voicing thoughts on it. Well, I'm not gonna deal with copyright claims. I don't want to see that stuff on my channel. Yep. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.